I'm feeling you get more of the camera than I get, Michael.
Am I getting more? All right. So I don't want to hog the camera. So let me just
scoot
turn
over so we got equal opportunity with that
equal
camera.
amount of camera. There
I
we
shaved
go.
this morning. Just
Okay.
For this.
I did. I actually, I shaved. I was clean shaven this morning when I woke up, and now look, I got all this. All right. So
That's a lie.
just sheer manliness.
That's a lie.
All right. Hey, before we get started, I wanted to. One of our subscribers said that we failed to mention that George C. Marshall was a VMI grad, a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. And so here it is for the record, George C. Marshall, one of the greatest military leaders our nation has ever had, graduate of VMI, right? And did you know? Okay, so if you go to up now, George C. Marshall aside, if you go up to a second lieutenant and you give them a Rubik's Cube and a Lanzetta compass, okay, it will produce the same effect. They will be lost for hours. Rubik's Cube and Lanzetta compass. They'll be lost, completely lost, second lieutenant. So ask anybody.
Patton went to BMI for 1 year and then went to West Point. So basically, it's kind of like a junior college.
It's like a junior college.
It's an excellent junior college for a military school.
George Patton, also an interesting character. Right.
Interesting dude.
Okay, so we're talking about the origins of the Cold War. All right, the Cold War, like I said last time, it starts really the roots of the Cold War are even before World War II. But for our purposes, we're looking at the Cold War as from the end of World War II all the way up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. They lowered that hammer and sickle flag over the Kremlin for the last time on Christmas of 1991.
You know what brought it down? This year I graduated from high school.
They heard that Mr. Anderson graduated from high school and said, that's the last straw.
It's time to stop this thing.
Time to call it. That's not quite it. We will talk about the factors that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but we're not quite there yet. So what you got to understand about the Cold War is that it is a conflict primarily between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States has a democratic form of government, and it has, what we would call a free market economy. The United States has a mixed economy. So for the most part, we have a free market. That means that privately owned businesses set the prices on products, and that those invisible forces that we talked about, supply and demand, tell us where things should go. Right now we do have some things that are social, that are like police, fire, public education, but for the most part, we're a free market. Mail is a socialized, as in society supports, police departments. It supports the military. We support mail delivery. There are certain things in our economy that we decided it's for the greater good that we support through our taxes, but we are primarily a free market economy. Now, the Soviet Union is a totalitarian government, and it is what it sounds like, totalitarian, total control. So the government basically dictates everything. There are very few individual rights and liberties, and the economy in a communist system is entirely controlled by the government. So instead of individual businesses, the government basically owns all the factors of production, all the factories and stores and things like that are government owned, and the government decides where things should go, how much should be produced of any particular thing, right? And it turns out that's not the best way to do things.
The Soviet Union was pretty much like living in the coronavirus 24 hours a day for the rest of your life.
Everything.
There was no toilet paper.
There was no toilet paper. Everything was rationed. Even worse, it was they would set quotas for everything. So instead of farmers growing wheat to turn a profit, Stalin would just say, you guys better grow this much wheat in this period of time or else. And it turns out that that's not the most effective way to manage.
Now, Mr. Pierce, last time you had lecture, you said that the Cold War was what?
An ideological conflict, a conflict of ideas.
So it's a war where they're not shooting at each other.
They're not. The United States and the Soviet Union technically do, on a few rare occasions, shoot at each other, but it's kept a secret. They do not directly confront each other.
Now, the Cold War does turn hot 3 times, doesn't it?
It does. It's a shooting war. Korea.
Vietnam,
Yep.
and when the Soviets attack
The
Afghanistan.
Soviets invaded Afghanistan. That's right. And those are very, very big conflicts. But in those conflicts, it's not the United States and Soviet Union directly confronting each other. They're fighting through what are called proxies. Think of like, like us as like coaches. We're the coaches, and the boxers in the ring are like North Korea and South Korea. So like Mr. Anderson is a Soviet. I'm an American.
Why do I have to be the Soviet?
Because
it's your story. I get it.
You look a lot more like the bear, and I look a lot more like the skinny Uncle Sam.
Oh, fat joke on this video. Nice. Well played, Coach.
So our boxers in the ring, I'm backing South Korea, and he's backing North Korea. We're really the ones calling the shots, if you will, but we're fighting through proxies. And now, why can't we take each other on? And besides the fact that he could probably beat me up pretty bad, we're both
mass retaliation.
Nuclear brinksmanship is the name of the game during the Cold War. And if the Soviet Union and the United States go to war, they will use nuclear weapons, and that means the end of life on Earth as we know it. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So let's not get too ahead of ourselves. All right. So a little background here. There's a very famous telegram. It's called the Long Telegram. It's made by a guy named George Kennan. He works at the embassy, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And he tells the U.S. government that basically what the Soviets want to do is spread communism all over the world. And so the United States position, their plan basically is to stop that from happening. They don't want to wipe out the Soviet Union. They don't want to attack the Soviet Union directly. They just want to contain the spread of communism. And the Soviets want to spread communism. And so that is pretty much the name of the game for the next 50 years. And that is going to be that idea that we have to contain communism wherever it rears its ugly head. So it doesn't matter, everything else aside, if a country is going to fall to communism, we've got to step in and prevent it from falling to communism, because if it falls to communism, then the other countries around it, like dominoes, will fall to communism, will spread the world over. And this idea that we have to contain the spread of communism is called the Truman Doctrine, and it is a foreign policy doctrine. If you guys remember, we talked about the Monroe Doctrine, right? Same kind of idea. This is a standard set of sort of policy as to how we're going to deal with this communist threat around the world.
Now, the reason Truman came up with this doctrine was because in '48, he let Chiang Kai-shek of China actually fall to Mao, who was a communist leader. And Truman was blasted for not stepping in and supporting Chiang Kai-shek.
We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about the sort of China falling to, if you will, communism. All right. So, like I said, things are heating up, no pun intended. And in the few years after World War II, it becomes increasingly clear to the United States and its Western European allies that they need some sort of collective defense, right? And so, we talked about the Berlin airlift and the Berlin blockade and all of the Soviet aggression, and so the United States and its allies formed the first peacetime military alliance, and this is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is a military alliance between the United States and its Western European allies. And there's a mutual defense agreement. So if one member of NATO is attacked, they all have to come to the aid of that country that was attacked. And Mr. Anderson, do you know when the last time that mutual defense clause was activated?
I do not.
It was 9/11. So when the United States was attacked on 9/11, all of our NATO allies had to send resources and troops to help defend us. And so that's why, like in Afghanistan and Iraq, you had coalition forces. You had countries from Western Europe participating in that conflict. All right. The Soviets, for their part, are going to have their own military alliance, and this is the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact is the Soviet Union and all of its Eastern European allies. And so the Warsaw Pact and NATO are basically your two sort of blocks, if you will.
It actually amps up tension because what happens is before it would have been one small nation like Germany versus Russia. Now all of a sudden it just takes one teenage kid with an airplane or a tank to mistakenly fire on the enemy, and the Warsaw Pact and the North Atlantic Treaty will drive these two nations to war. So one little incident, one little mistake, one little bad decision could cause this whole continent to go up into war and bring about what everyone feared at this time period, which was World War III. So the Warsaw Pact served a purpose in trying to keep the nations minding their P's and Q's, but it also added to the tension that was going on during this time.
I mean, remember, East and West Berlin, Berlin is a city that's divided in half, and you have Warsaw Pact troops and NATO troops facing each other across very narrow borders. And like Mr. Anderson said, all it really takes is one person making a mistake, and you could inadvertently cause World War III. So in 1949, something very dramatic happens. Now, the Chinese had been fighting a civil war even before World War II.
Yep. They called a hiatus during World War II so they could fight together against the Japanese. And as soon as the war ended,
Right.
they went right back at it.
You had the nationalists who were led by Chiang Kai-shek, and you had the communists who were led by Mao Zedong. And it was sort of one of those, the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of things. And they both kind of stopped fighting each other to fight the Japanese. Well, World War II ended, and they just picked right up where they left off. Well, eventually, Mao Zedong won. Now, here's something interesting. Mao Zedong became, leader of the Communist Party in charge of mainland China. Chiang Kai-shek left and went to an island called Formosa that you would refer to today as Taiwan, but Taiwan refers to itself as the Republic of China and sees itself as the legitimate government of China and considers, and vice versa, the Communist Party in China considers itself to be a legitimate government. It looks kind of like at Taiwan as like a wayward son, if you will.
They were actually talking about last year, China thought about attacking Taiwan and taking it back. So there's still tension over it.
It's been a constant kind of point of contention, and there's even small islands around Taiwan have become sort of dangerous spots where things could quickly boil over into World War III. So with Mao Zedong and the communists taking over China in 1949, everybody was kind of shocked, and the Western world was terrified. They were like, "Oh, this whole country, this huge country, is now communist, and communism is taking over the world." And at first, it seemed really, really bad. Well, it turns out that the Chinese and the Russians, the Soviets, end up becoming kind of adversaries. So instead of becoming kind of, communist partners fighting the West together, they kind of start to battle each other for who is in charge of the communist revolution. You see, what had happened was Stalin had died, and Mao looked at himself as the new legitimate leader of global communism, and he really didn't respect the new Soviet leader. That's Nikita Khrushchev right here. In fact, I read that Nikita Khrushchev went to visit Mao Zedong one time, and Mao heard that he couldn't swim. So guess where Mao decided to have his meeting?
In the pool.
In the pool.
What a jerk.
And so while Mao paddled around kind of effortlessly, poor Nikita Khrushchev here struggled to stay afloat. And that's really a good way to kind of describe the relationship between China and Russia. It was a very rocky, kind of hostile one. And so this ended up working out in our favor. The United States was actually able to kind of become a little bit friendly with China. And in the 1970s, Mr. Anderson, the phone went off. In the 1970s, Richard Nixon actually traveled to China. He was the first U.S. president to travel to a communist country and meet with its leader, and U.S. and Chinese relations improved significantly. Well, this is really bad for the Soviets, who want to spread communism the world over. Now the United States has sort of a cozier relationship with the most populous communist government in the world.
Well, this is where we get the pictures of Richard Nixon standing on the Great Wall of China with Mao.
Right. So when we talked about World War II, I told you guys about the Trinity test, and we exploded the world's first nuclear device in the desert in Alamogordo, that's in New Mexico, in 1945. So the United States splits the atom, has nuclear weapons. Well, the Russians, the Soviets, had tons of spies in our atomic program. And we'll talk a little bit about Julius and Ethel Rosenberg later, but know that they had lots of spies in our program. And so, like, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg snuck schematics out in a Jello box, right? And so, as a result of this extensive spy network that they had within our nuclear program, the Russians developed nuclear weapons very quickly in 1945. So now both countries have nuclear weapons. Well, here's the thing. Research and development doesn't just stop there, and nuclear weapons become increasingly powerful. And I'm going to show you guys. So if you look at this first two right here, these are Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and we talked about those. So these two bombs together kill about 120,000 people and destroy two entire Japanese cities. Okay, but if you look, they're relatively small compared to, this is one of the U.S.'s most kind of notorious, what's called a thermonuclear weapon. You might hear it referred to as like the hydrogen bomb. And so they started to use something called boosting. I'm not a physicist, but they used deuterium to kind of increase the yield. Well, look at this thermonuclear weapon. Look at the size of the mushroom cloud. Look at the size of the blast radius compared to these immensely powerful weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So thermonuclear weapons are incredibly powerful. Look at this one that the Russians deployed. This thing was aircraft delivered. That means people in a plane dropped it and it blew up. How'd you like to be that pilot?
I would not.
I would not like to be that pilot either. Massive thing, 50 megaton thermonuclear weapon. Just a huge, huge thing. And by the way, in a short time later, both the United States and the Russians and the Soviets are going to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles. And these are missiles that go up into orbit and they transit across the globe and come back down. They re-enter, and then when they come back in, they have what are called multiple re-entry vehicles. Or basically, the warhead or the end of that missile is filled with thermonuclear devices. And so maybe there's like 6 to 8 of these things. So one missile can kill 6 cities. You do the math, it doesn't really take a lot to get to the point where everybody is going to die. So
most Americans also think that we only dropped 2 nuclear bombs, but between 1945 and about 1980, there were some 2,000 bombs dropped on this earth.
Huge amounts of nuclear
blowing
testing.
up islands.
Mm-hmm.
We've bombed Arizona to the point where it should glow at night like a watch.
So this one right here, Castle Bravo, that was conducted in the Marshall Islands at a place called Eniwetok. All right, and that's a small little island chain called Bikini Atoll. And they got the math wrong. It was twice as big as they thought it was going to be. So they accidentally irradiated a bunch of Japanese fishermen and caused all sorts of radiation injuries to Marshall Islanders who had to be evacuated. It was basically, when this thing exploded, it vaporized the coral on the bottom of the ocean. It threw that radioactive coral ash into the atmosphere and then rained radioactive coral ash across hundreds of miles of the Pacific.
Which just shows that the scientists really didn't know what they were doing either. It was just a shot in the dark to see who can make the biggest effect.
Right. And when you get down that road, it's hard to stop. And what you need to understand is that both the United States and the Soviets had enough weapons to destroy the Earth multiple times. And here's the problem. The United States, say in the 1950s and 1960s, had a huge advantage in terms of the number of missiles, the number of aircraft delivered nuclear weapons. We certainly had a bigger arsenal. But I think it was Isaac Asimov had a good quote. And he said, so if you have 2 sworn enemies, and they're both standing waist deep in gasoline, and one has 4 matches, and the other has 3, does it really matter who has more matches? It does not. And so it doesn't really matter who has more nuclear missiles. Everybody's going to die in a nuclear war. And that is why this guy right here, and if you remember, he was Supreme Allied Commander, architect of D-Day, Operation Overlord. Now he's President of the United States, and he is going to introduce something called massive retaliation. So when Eisenhower comes into office, he finds out that his generals have been working on plans for a limited as in a non-nuclear war with Russia. Well, Mr. Anderson, any war with Russia, common sense dictates, is going to involve what? Nuclear weapons. So you know what Eisenhower says? He says, get rid of them. We are no longer going to plan to fight a limited war with Russia. The new plan is to target every single communist city in the world with nuclear weapons. If we get in a war with Russia, we will nuke every communist capital in the world simultaneously. Is Eisenhower crazy?
No.
Does Eisenhower want war? Is he bloodthirsty?
Nope, he's saber rattling. Trying to keep the enemy watching his P's and Q's.
That's right.
And this is not just his idea. He used a guy by the name of John Foster Dulles to help him come up with the concept of mass retaliation.
He was also probably a reader of a guy named Karl von Clausewitz. Ooh. Karl von Clausewitz, who over 100 years before all this, said eventually wars will become so destructive that people just won't fight. And so Eisenhower knows if you plan for a limited war, that makes more likely. But if you say the only option for war is an impossible option, well, guess what? You don't fight the war. Right, so Eisenhower, pretty smart guy. All right, and there they are again, and you can take a look. And this is why really even today, I mean, look at that. This is the average, that's 30,000 feet. That's the average cruising altitude of a commercial airliner. Here's Mount Everest. Here is Castle Bravo. And this is the 50 megaton bomb that the Soviets dropped in Siberia. And if that's not sobering, I don't know what is. This is the existential threat. Forget about coronavirus. This, even in the midst of coronavirus, is the most dangerous thing to the continued existence of our species. All right, so here we go, the Truman Doctrine in action. So a little background: North Korea, at the in the years after World War II, North Korea, Soviet-backed communist. South Korea is within the United States sort of sphere of influence and is kind of democratic, right? Well, the Russians thought that we didn't really care about the Korean Peninsula, so they went ahead and authorized the government of North Korea to invade South Korea and spread communism all the way down the peninsula. All right, and so in 1950, you're going to see communist North Korea invade the democratic South. Well, the Truman Doctrine dictates that we do what, Mr. Anderson?
That we defend the nations that are free.
Doesn't matter how much interest we have in that particular nation. Doesn't matter if there's resources there or if it's within our sphere of influence. If it's communism and it's spreading, we have to contain it. So says the Truman Doctrine. So that means we're going to get involved. And the North Koreans head north or head south very, very quickly. So if you look at this map, okay, when the North Koreans invade, they drive all the way down, they take Seoul very quickly, and they advance. But the problem that they run into is their supply lines get really kind of dragged out. Well, MacArthur, you guys remember MacArthur from the Pacific Campaign during World War II, aviator sunglasses, corncob pipe, the whole 9 yards, right? He is going to stage a really effective amphibious landing right here in Incheon. And so he is going to basically launch a huge amphibious force that is going to disrupt those North Korean supply lines and send them retreating in disarray back in North Korea. All right?
Now, what did Truman tell MacArthur not to do?
Truman told MacArthur that under no circumstances was he to take the fight all the way up across the Manchurian border into China. Here's the thing. At this point, the Chinese have nuclear weapons, okay? And if he gets a war going in Manchuria, that he could potentially cause World War III. MacArthur had some wacky ideas, too. So in addition to wanting to, invade China and cross into China, he also, my understanding is that he wanted to spread a band of radioactive cobalt across the peninsula to keep the North Koreans from coming back down. Crazy stuff. Well, anyway, what ends up happening to MacArthur?
MacArthur gets replaced because Truman, the buck stops here. Truman's not going to put up with this stuff. And Truman replaces him with a much more mild-mannered Mark Clark, I want to say it is.
Right. Remember I told you guys, like, MacArthur's a little bit egotistical. And so he was very defiant in his dealings with Truman, and that ended up getting him fired. Right. So what happens is the United States coalition forces, their South Korean allies, advance all the way up, into Pyongyang, and they're heading up. Well, what we don't know is that the Chinese have already entered the war, and they have huge amounts of forces gathered in North Korea. And what you're going to get are massive, massive human wave attacks of Chinese. They're going to drive us all the way back down the peninsula. Well, long story short, eventually fighting is going to stabilize right here along the 38th parallel, right? And did the war ever end, Mr. Anderson?
Technically, no. But what happens is Eisenhower steps in. He becomes a candidate for the Republican Party and runs and wins the presidency, and Truman decides not to run for a second term. Eisenhower, being a past general, decides that he's going to deal with the Chinese by saber rattling because we had numerous nuclear weapons. And he told them, if we can either sign this armistice or we can start using nuclear weapons. It's your choice. And the Chinese decided that that's probably the best choice. So through saber rattling again, Eisenhower was able to prevent the war from going further.
Now, technically, the agreement that was signed that brought the fighting in Korea to an end was an armistice. An armistice is not a peace treaty. It's a ceasefire. So they agreed just to stop shooting at each other. And that has been the case ever since. Technically, the two Koreas are still at war. And if you go to Korea today, I spent a year there, they have a heavily fortified border between North and South Korea. And it's called the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ for short. And it's full of razor wire and landmines and guard towers, and it is an impenetrable sort of wasteland, if you will, the most heavily militarized border on the planet, the DMZ. And both sides patrol it pretty regularly. Excuse me. All right, both sides patrol it pretty regularly. They have one little meeting place in the middle. That's called the JSA. And occasionally the two sides will meet there to discuss things. But North Korea, which is nicknamed the Hermit Kingdom because they're very, very isolationist, all right, really only has a relationship with China and is cut off from the outside world in many ways, while South Korea is a very modern, very advanced, one of the strongest economies in the world.
Aren't they called the Asian tiger?
They are called the Asian tiger. They have the 5th largest economy in the world. It's pretty incredible. So once again, the Korean War, U.S. and its South Korean allies helped defend South Korea against communist expansion, the Truman Doctrine in action. Fighting stops at the 38th parallel, which divides the peninsula in half, and it remains divided today.
So what happens in Vietnam is this. We go through Korea, and Korea, the war really, we didn't fight that war to win it. We fought that war as not for us to go out and defeat the Koreans, but just to hold them off because of the Truman Doctrine. And we basically had 38,000 Americans die just to hold that line, to hold that border. The next time it turns hot, it's going to be in Vietnam. Vietnam used to be, before World War II, was controlled by the French. And after World War II, the Vietnamese wanted to control their country again, but we decided that we were going to back the French instead of backing the Vietnamese.
Ho Chi Minh, actually, who ends up being the leader of communist North Vietnam, rescues an American pilot. And he hopes that by demonstrating this willingness to help during World War II, his country would be granted its independence after the war. He had listened to these ideas about self-determination. FDR was a big proponent of decolonization. FDR died of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1945, and Truman was not as ardent and was not as insistent that the European countries give up their colonies.
And he had a leaning towards communism. And this made him
Didn't matter.
unexcusable for us.
If he even had a hint of communism, he was an enemy, public enemy. Yep.
So what happens is the Vietnamese fight the French. And in 54, the Vietnamese forced the French out. But
that's what is the name of that Dien Bien Phu?
Dien Bien Phu.
The Dien Bien Phu. For some reason, the French built a military base in what was basically a valley, a geographical bowl, and so the North Vietnamese just surrounded it with artillery. And the last radio transmission to come out of that fire base was, "We're being overrun. We're blowing everything up. Vive la France!" And they left.
Didn't work out well.
No.
So what happened is when the French left, you have your Vietnam split in half. You had South Vietnam, which was supposed to be a democracy, and North Vietnam, which was ran by the communists. Now, South Vietnam, which was supposed to be this democracy, was actually ran by a guy by the name of Diem. And Diem was corrupt. He was a corrupt leader. The people didn't trust Diem.
Right.
The Vietnamese didn't trust Diem. And South Vietnam was a Buddhist nation. And he was a Catholic because he had close ties to the French.
And so almost all of the South Vietnamese political leaders
were Catholic. And the Buddhists felt like they were being persecuted. So what happened is that the North Vietnamese decided that they could probably take over and help I believe it was called the Viet Cong, try to overthrow South Vietnam.
Viet Cong, think of the Viet Cong as basically like sort of insurgent fighters, if you will. They're not uniformed North Vietnamese army. They're citizens of South Vietnam who take up arms and sort of fight, sort of like militia.
Well, what happens is that North Vietnam attacks South Vietnam. North Vietnam is being backed and given weapons by the Chinese and the Soviets. And we're afraid that South Vietnam is going to fall to this communist nation.
No, we cannot allow that.
We cannot allow that because of the Truman Doctrine. So the first president to send people over there was advisors. Eisenhower in 59 sent some advisors over there. Kennedy sent about 2,000 to 3,000 advisors. Now, we know what happens to Kennedy. Kennedy dies.
Yeah. In Dallas in 1963.
63. Johnson takes over, and Johnson gets this, and Johnson decides that, Johnson takes over as a vice president. He doesn't get to pick his own cabinet. He inherits the cabinet of Kennedy. And they decide that the best way to do this is just overwhelm the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong with our numbers.
What is it, over 500,000 troops in 1965?
By 60, actually it was 66, 67, 68, we ratcheted up to 500,000 American soldiers over there. And most of those young men that went over there, if you asked them on a map, hey, show me where Vietnam is, would not have any idea. Just like if I asked you where Vietnam was, most of you would not be able to find it on a map. So what happens is that we run into this war. Now, I'm not sure what's on the next slide.
Let's take a look.
The defeat of North Vietnamese.
So it's important to understand that from a tactical perspective, that on the ground, American forces have a lot of success against the North Vietnamese. We defeat them in every engagement. Every time we meet them on the battlefield, we win. But here's the problem. It was a war of attrition. The North Vietnamese, the NVA and the Viet Cong had been fighting, had been fighting for their independence way before the Americans were ever there. They had grown up sort of fighting for independence. And if you think all the way back to the beginning of the year when we talked about the American Revolution, I said the British Empire is this hugely powerful, technologically advanced. The sun never set on the British Empire. But their war machine bogged down and found itself unable to score a decisive victory in North America against really ragtag American militia. This is the same scenario. It doesn't matter how much money and how many troops we pump into North Vietnam, we're not going to be able to score a decisive win. We don't want to invade North Vietnam because that is too dangerous. There's a potential there for a larger war, maybe even a nuclear war with China. And the Soviets. So we're only going to fight them as they trickle down into South Vietnam. Now, we will start bombing campaigns later on, but you've got to imagine we can't score a decisive victory. And Ho Chi Minh put it best. Ho Chi Minh was the leader of North Vietnam, and he famously said, we were willing to lose the war longer than you were willing to win it. And that was really the truth. As Americans watched death tolls climb in this seemingly endless war, they became more and more disenchanted with the effort there, and eventually public opinion turned against it.
So public opinion turns in 68. In 68, what happens is the U.S. government had been telling the American people that the Vietnamese are ready to surrender.
The war is going
to be over.
Right.
And on Tet is the Vietnamese
New Year.
They do a massive attack. They attack Hue City. They attack the Marines at Khe Sanh.
Mhm.
They attack in Saigon, and the Vietnamese just get slaughtered by the American troops.
Yeah.
But what it shows is this:
They're not done
they
fighting.
are not done fighting, and the Americans are tired of paying higher taxes. They're tired of sending their children over there to fight in a war that they don't quite understand why they're fighting. And the news, the media starts turning on the war. There's a famous
Walter Cronkite.
Walter Cronkite.
What did he call it?
He starts doubting the war. And what does he say?
Pretty much the war in the United States ends when Walter Cronkite goes on the air and says it's a quagmire. When you think of a quagmire, think of like what is it, like sand, quicksand, right? You get into it, you just can't quite get out. And so when he calls the war a quagmire, public opinion turns vehemently against the war. The Johnson administration had been lying to the American people. Now they knew it and they wanted out. And you start to see protests, anti-war protests, start to spike across the nation, especially on college campuses. There was strong public opinion against the war, and people wanted out of Vietnam.
The sad part of the protest is that a lot of the protesters took it above and beyond and blamed the American soldiers over there.
Yes.
Most of the soldiers that went to Vietnam went there because they had no option. They had no choice.
That's right.
And when they came home, they did the best that they could do. And sometimes they were actually persecuted for what they did.
Remember, it's really important to keep in mind that soldiers don't start wars, politicians start wars, so we don't blame the war on the individual soldiers. All right.
You also got to take into consideration Johnson's point of view. If the U.S. government, you got to remember, by this time, we've had over 30,000 Americans were killed in Vietnam. How do you just say, okay, we're done? We're done. We're going to leave. How do you say we're going to leave when there's been 30,000 people killed there? The parents of those people, the friends of those people are going to be outraged.
And guess what Johnson's advisors are going to tell him the answer is?
What? Fight, send more soldiers.
More soldiers. Right.
But Johnson doesn't run for re-election in 68. We're going to get a new president coming in 68, and his name is going to be Richard Milhous Nixon.
That's right. So Johnson decided not to run for re-election, and a big part of that was
Bobby Kennedy.
Bobby Kennedy, and he hoped to a certain extent that the North Vietnamese would be more willing to negotiate with him if there was not a political angle. Right, supposedly, according to Johnson's wife, he would talk in his sleep at night about Vietnam. He was absolutely just Johnson had a lot of things he wanted to do as president, but this war really defined his presidency and really wore on his psyche. And so he decides not to run for re-election. Nixon is elected. Now, Nixon is going to end up resigning in disgrace. And we're going to talk about Watergate next time. But for now, we're just going to focus on his plan. So Nixon says he has a plan to end the war in Vietnam with honor.
The Vietnamization.
Vietnamization. That's right. What is Vietnamization? What is the idea here?
Vietnamization means that we are going to go in and we're going to train the South Vietnamese. We're going to give them the weapons. We're going to give them the abilities to go out and win this war on their own. And once that infrastructure is set in, we're going to pull out, and the South Vietnamese will finish this war themselves. The problem is that they never fixed the true problem. And the true problem is that it was a democracy in name. The whole government of South Vietnam was corrupt. The people don't trust the government. And if you don't trust your government, are you ever going to be successful in fighting a foe? And it turns out that's why Vietnamization didn't work. People didn't trust the South Vietnamese government. Some of the troops that we trained in Vietnamization actually turn and go to the Viet Cong.
If you think about it too, like we've had special forces in Vietnam training the South Vietnamese all of this time. Just simply handing over our equipment, doing a little bit of training, and then, hey, okay, you guys got it from here? All right, we're out. How is that, after all the resources and all the troops we put into Vietnam, somehow going to win? And it was really a front. And I don't think anybody was really terribly convinced that it was going to work. So Vietnamization, this idea that we're going to train the Vietnamese troops, the South Vietnamese troops, send military aid to Vietnam, let them take over our equipment and our bases, and that they'll somehow win the war is really just a farce.
It was a shot to try to end this thing with dignity, and in the end, we had to leave. We have to leave because either you're going to pump more soldiers into a cause that in 1964, Johnson's administration knew this thing was going to be almost impossible to win.
Probably the surest symbol of the failure of Vietnamization was these sort of hectic evacuations that occurred from the American embassy there in Saigon. And so basically you had South Vietnamese refugees and all of the American embassy personnel, people just desperately trying to get out of the country as it rapidly was falling to communism and to North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops. And these pictures, if you look, these are Huey helicopters. And what they're doing is they're pushing the helicopters off of the decks of carriers and amphibious landing ships to make room for more helicopters so that more people can escape in this sort of desperate evacuation at the end of the war. If this isn't a poignant example of the failure of Vietnamization, I don't know what is. Right.
You would like to think that after the mistakes we made in Vietnam that we learned what we were doing. We'd also like to think that after what happened in Korea and Vietnam that other nations would learn from what happened in these wars. But it was less than 5 years, well, actually just about 5 years, that the Soviets get themselves into their own Vietnam and Afghanistan. So these historical events that happen, they just build upon each other, and people should be learning what they're learning. They should be learning from the mistakes that were made in the past that just don't seem to be happening. Mr. Pierce, do you have anything you'd like to end with?
Yeah, well, when we come back next time, we'll talk a little bit about the Watergate scandal and the resignation of Richard Nixon, and we will talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Ooh.
All right, where we almost just narrowly missed doing it, right? We talked about how we can't go to war with the Soviets. Well, guess what? We almost do during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
You know what Fidel Castro's favorite sport was?
Soccer.
Now, you would think, because most communist leaders do like soccer.
This is true.
He liked baseball.
He liked baseball.
He was a baseball
Fidel
player.
Castro wanted to be our friend, but he was communist, so we couldn't be friends.
No friends.
More on that later. We'll talk to you guys next time.